You gotta bake a cake before you put icing on it.
If you want a taller pyramid, you need to build a bigger base.
You can't fire a cannon out of a canoe.
You can't make a stew without any onions. All right, I made that last one up, but there are so many analogies in endurance sport about why you need to do base training. But do you? Do you really? I mean, who wants to fire a cannon off a canoe anyway? So we're going to clear that up. But firstly, what even is base training? Base training is traditionally thought of as long, low-intensity rides done repeatedly over successive weeks or even a couple of months in the early winter, in order to build up your aerobic capacity and also to prepare your body for harder, high-intensity training as the season gets closer. Now, this is a very traditional approach to training based, as you can imagine, around a seasonal race or event calendar. And it's got to be said, if you're looking to win a race in July, then maybe you should be base training in December. Certainly, if that race that you're trying to win in July happens to be the Tour de France, I think we can all say, yes, do some base training at this time of year. For no other reason other than the fact that Tadej Pogacar's coach, Dr. Inigo San Millán, told us that that's what they do. However, he wasn't advocating exclusively doing low-intensity Zone 2 rides. And also, how applicable is that to the rest of us, given that we perhaps don't have a seasonal race calendar, and also, more realistically, we don't have 25 hours a week to train? So, what should we be doing then? We've asked Neil Henderson this time, who is the Uber coach at Wahoo. He has also trained a whole load of World Tour pros, both male and female, and now puts all of his training know-how into practice in his work at Wahoo for the benefit of the rest of us. We did interview Neil not in a pub, which is what it sounds like, and even though Dan Lloyd was doing the interviewing, at the Ruler Bike Show, hence the background noise. But apparently they did have beer there, so that's good.
So base training has kind of historically been this period where coaches and folks that are involved in helping athletes get better is recommending several weeks, even several months of consistently low intensity training, but high volume training. And that's kind of the classic idea. There have been some changes over time that some coaches and others believe that there's different ways of achieving that goal. And when you have an athlete who has been training for a long period of time, it may not be as beneficial to spend 3 months at a very low intensity. You're not going to see a lot of change in fitness or performance. And so there have been some differences in approach lately where some folks will do a little bit more intensity earlier than they have in the past. I'd say a really good example of that is what we see with track cycling and cyclocross racers actually having a lot of success in road cycling. And they, by nature, are not following any kind of a similar old school based training methodology. In the winter months, fall and winter months, they're actually training and competing at some of the highest, most intense levels, and then going on to the season and expanding the amount of riding volume they do with that intensity. And I'd say, you know, the results indicate some pretty high performances, whether you go back to the boss Mariana Vos doing this, racing on the track, racing cyclocross, and being the absolute best on the road, to in the mountains peloton now, you've got a guy, Wout van Aert, fairly successful. If we go back another 10 years, some of the track cyclists that were, again, at the top of the game on the track, Bradley Wiggins, Mark Cavendish, transferring that onto the road to the highest level of success. So I would say old school base training isn't necessarily the only, nor is it potentially the best way to prepare for a high level of performance in the summer. I would say with the classic base training versus kind of this new idea of having more intense winter and preparation training is that somebody who's just getting started definitely does need to establish some level of an aerobic foundation. riders and athletes who have several years of foundation under their belts can kind of accelerate adding in that intensity. Though if you're a very ranked novice in cycling, you do need to establish some foundation. With that in mind, I would also say that it's really important to consider some other things that, again, are almost taboo in the old way of adding strength training. Some bit of what we do in that foundation phase, that early phase of training, is establish structural integrity to be able to tolerate more training without getting injuries, especially overuse injuries. Tendinitis is when we do too much work that the tendon can't tolerate what the muscle has done. And so when we add something like strength training into what we do in the early phase of training, we increase that integrity, and it's not just the muscles that we're training with strength training, it's actually the tendons. And the tendons can then tolerate that load of endurance training and higher intensity training as we build into the season. So I think there's a few different layers that you can look at building that level of foundation fitness that are, again, different than what the classic view of a base training would look like. I do not believe, and I've not worked with many athletes where we just do a block of no other quality other than low intensity, especially if they're in a lower training volume. Even a world-class professional, whether it's Taylor Phinney, Evelyn Stevens, Rowan Dennis that I've coached over the years, there was never a period that it was, okay, we're gonna do 2 months of low intensity heart rate below X or power below Y. It was always, we're gonna be doing a little something in there that has purpose and progression so that they feel like they're accomplishing something too, because training is not just about your legs and your lungs and your heart. You have to have your mind in a good place. And so sometimes being able to address something that has maybe historically been a weakness for you will fortify your mental capacity, or same thing is your strength. Whatever you have as a weapon as a rider, if you can make that weapon even bigger and stronger, well, guess what? I mean, you swing a bigger sword, you can lop off more heads. So for the average person who maybe is riding 5, 6, 7, 8 hours a week, base training would probably still include one day that is a longer session with a low intensity, but you may also add to that one real quality day, again, working on a strength or a weakness, and then another day or two that are in the low to moderate intensity realm. So that, again, with that lower training volume, your body can adapt if you add a little bit of moderate intensity in there. It doesn't have to be all exclusively very low intensity. You could be adding in some, what we might call tempo, or some people call sweet spot. It's below your FTP or your threshold, but it's just a little bit elevated above that real low intensity zone 2 kind of conversation pace.
Okay, I know what you're thinking. Doesn't that completely contradict what Dr. Inigo San Milan was saying in a previous video about zone 2 training? Yes, slightly, but we will come on to that. Firstly, I want to say huge thanks to Neil. It is fantastic hearing from sports scientists and coaches who train World Tour pros, but yet have experience of training total beginners as well. And personally, I felt like what Neil said really resonated with me. Strength training feels like a much better use of time to get meaningful adaptations anyway, rather than trying to squeeze in these super long rides. And also, it's what the pros are doing as well. It's just that they've got the time to do the long rides as well. But if you're doing something on the indoor trainer, you can do a meaningful zone 2 ride in an hour or an hour and a half. And I also think that for those of us who have got a history of training, nudging into those slightly higher intensities is also a really good idea, just to try and get some kind of training load and avoid detraining. But I think we could all be clear on the fact that we should be avoiding doing super hard, nightmarishly high intensity intervals in these kind of base periods. Give them a bit of a rest. The idea of phasing the types of training that you're doing seems really appealing, because constantly doing the same mix of training will get you so far with your fitness, but it's only going to get you so far. You will reach a plateau. So doing, as Neil suggests, working on an area of fitness or a weakness consistently for a couple of weeks or a few weeks at a time seems like a really good idea. And some form of base training definitely fits into that model. But does it need to be done in early winter? Because you see, I think there's cool stuff going on in the cycling calendar 365 days a year now. And so is this the best time to be doing long, steady rides? I don't want to be sat on my bike going steady for 4 hours at a time in the rain. So why not do a cyclocross season and be as good as Wout van Aert, or do some Zwift racing, or just go and belt up a few hills close to home and come home before you freeze your knackers off. And actually then, why not look at doing base training in its traditional sense when the weather gets a little bit better, or before the weather got too bad? Or if you're lucky enough, book yourself a cycling holiday somewhere in the middle of winter and go and do a 20-hour week somewhere nice and dry and warm. And what about that apparent contradiction with Inigo San Millán then? Clearly, San Millán is a much bigger advocate of Zone 2 training than Neil is, but it's important to remember that he wasn't advocating only doing low-intensity Zone 2 training. You've still got to keep that high intensity in there, but he was stressing the importance of Zone 2, as well as some of the nuances, like doing Zone 2 training before you end up doing your high-intensity intervals in training rides as well. Also, it's worth saying that it's absolutely fine for coaches and sports scientists to disagree on the nuances of training, because there are no hard and fast rules. I spent years trying to find magic training sessions that would unlock my hidden talent and allow me to take over the cycling world. And clearly, that never happened. But that's because the older I get, the more I realise there is no magic formula. Tadej Pogačar and Annemiek van Vleuten are not the best riders in the world because they do the best training. Clearly, they do the training that works, but it works for them. Everybody is different. We've got different physiologies, we've got different lifestyles, we're different ages. So you have to find the type of training that works for you. And I know that sounds like a particularly unhelpful statement, but the good news is that your body will tell you what's right for you if you listen to it. So write down the type of training that you're doing and analyse your performance. You can become a one-person human science experiment. So if, for example, your goal is to increase your FTP by 30 watts, but yet no matter how many high-intensity interval training sessions you do, you cannot quite get there, well, stop. Do something different. Do a few weeks of base training, then come back to your high-intensity intervals and see whether it's helped you improve. It's only by experimenting with these things you will ultimately find out what's the optimal training for you at that point in time. And maybe base training is it. Only you will know. The final point is that ultimately you should hopefully be trying to do training and riding that you enjoy. Because if you don't, training is so much harder and it can get boring and then you get stale and then you'll probably end up wanting to quit. So even if your goal is to win the Tour de France, I suspect one of the secrets to getting there is to just love doing what you're doing. Anyway, like I said, big thanks to Neil for giving us his insights on base training. Hopefully you found this video interesting, insightful, even if it's left you with more questions than you have answers. But get involved in the comments section down below. If you've got questions, we'll come and address them in a follow-up video.